The hall was too bright for what was about to unfold. Chandeliers spilled their cold light across white tablecloths, polished glasses, and plates still warm from the main course. It was one of those evenings meant to be remembered for speeches, polite laughter, and photographs in perfect frames. But memory had other plans. Before we go deeper, remember to subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might change how this story is heard. She stood beneath the light, her navy dress straight, her posture flawless. To everyone else, she looked calm, poised, almost statuesque. Yet inside her, words sharpened themselves like knives waiting to be drawn. She had carried them for too long. Tonight, all it would take was one careless touch to cut the thread holding everything together. It happened with a sentence so small it could have been forgotten in seconds. A man at the second table, leaning forward with a smile that thought itself kind, said, "You're so sensitive. That's what makes you special." The words were soft, but the silence that followed was hard. Forks paused. A chair stopped mid-scoot. Even the music faltered, as if the instruments felt the weight that had just entered the room. He believed he had given her a compliment. He did not understand the chain he had just pulled. Her eyes narrowed, slow as shutters closing on sunlight. She could have laughed, could have brushed it aside with a graceful wave, and the night would have carried on without incident. But laughter is a bridge, and she had burned too many to build another. Her voice when it came was calm, too calm. Calm like the stillness before a storm. "What did you call me?" The microphone caught her tone and carried it to every corner of the room. It was not loud, yet it rang louder than any toast. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Heads turned toward her, then toward the man, then back again. He chuckled nervously, confused by the sudden gravity of her question. "Sensitive," he repeated. "That's all I said. Sensitive." Her lips curved, not into a smile but into something sharper. "Sensitive. You think it means kind. You think it means fragile. But when you say it, what you mean is that I break too easily. What you mean is that my pain is my fault because I feel it. What you mean is that silence should be my cure and gratitude should be my answer. Isn't that what you meant?" The room grew colder. A waiter, balancing a tray of chocolate tarts, froze mid-step, afraid to cross the line of fire. Near the back, two teenagers lifted their phones, instinctively recording what felt like history in the making. "I won't be quiet," she said, her words spreading through the hall like ink through water. She turned not only to him but to everyone present, and suddenly the dinner had become a trial. "You call it sensitivity because you don't want to call it memory. You call it overreaction because you don't want to call it a pattern. You want the story to be about my nerves. But the story," she paused, her eyes fixed on him, "is about your hands." A murmur rippled through the tables, quickly smothered. Someone clapped once and then thought better of it. The MC, stranded on stage, forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The sound technician leaned toward the board, wishing volume could fix meaning. She stepped closer to the edge of the stage and the room leaned with her. There was still a chance, a small one, to soften what had been said, to ease the tension before it snapped. But she closed that path herself. "Do you remember," she asked, her voice slicing the silence, "what you said to me last winter, Daniel? A name in a crowded room is never just a name. It is a blade that finds its mark." Daniel blinked, his smile collapsing. "I don't think this is the time." "It is exactly the time," she cut him off. Her voice trembled only once, then steadied like steel cooling. "You think I've forgotten? The comments you slipped like little stones into my pockets, heavy enough to drag me down? You dressed them as advice, as concern, but each one cut a little deeper. And when I reacted, you called it sensitivity, as if I were the problem for bleeding." The room shifted. Faces turned toward Daniel, then back to her. The air thickened, loyalties bending like grass in wind. People had come for wine and speeches. Instead, they were witnessing a reckoning. When she finished, silence fell harder than applause ever could. A fork clattered against china and echoed like a bell. Somewhere behind the velvet curtain, a manager drafted excuses for tomorrow's emails. But she wasn't done. Her voice dropped, softer, almost intimate. "You think I bruise too easily," she said. "But what bruises is often what has already been broken." Her gaze slipped past the tables, past the chandeliers, past the present itself, into a place no one else could see. Her shoulders lowered, then steadied as though she were carrying a familiar weight. "Let me explain," she whispered, "why a single word can feel like a knife." The chandeliers seemed to dim, or maybe it was the audience narrowing their attention, holding their breath for what came next. The gala was no longer a celebration. It had turned into a confession chamber. Nothing begins the moment you see it, she continued. By the time you witness the explosion, the fuse has been burning for years. She paused, and in that silence the room felt as if a door had opened, not in the hall but in her memory. Behind her eyes, a smaller world waited. Before tonight, she said, there were other rooms? Rooms you've never seen. Quieter rooms. Walls that listen more than people did. If you want to understand me, if you want to know why I am who I am, you'll have to follow me back there. A chair scraped softly as though to make space for the past to sit down among them. The teenagers lowered their phones. The waiter finally set down his tray. Every eye fixed on her as the night tilted toward the beginning of a story none of them expected to hear. And so the hall held its breath as she reached back, pulling everyone with her, not to this chandelier, not to this stage, but to a narrow hallway that smelled of lemon soap and winter coats. A hallway where the first cracks had formed, long before anyone thought to call her sensitive. That is where it truly begins. The hallway smelled of lemon soap and winter coats. A weak bulb blinked and settled. She was 8, thin-shouldered in a sweater that scratched. In this house she was Elena. Outside she learned to answer to anything. In the kitchen her mother peeled apples. The knife rose and fell with metronome certainty. Mind your tone, she said without looking up. Tone mattered more than meaning. Elena nodded, because nodding had fewer consequences than speech. At the table her father read the paper. When he raised his eyes it was to measure, not to meet. Love here was an economy of absence. Elena tried to be useful. She stacked plates, folded towels exactly so. But the world was full of traps. Don't slam, her mother said when a cabinet closed itself. Don't sulk, when Elena was only thinking. Don't argue, when she asked a question. Words arrived with labels already attached. At school she learned the choreography of apology. A teacher bent her name into a joke, then laughed off her flinch. You're too sensitive, the teacher ruled. She lowered her eyes. Everybody agreed that was mature. A neighbor called her dramatic when she startled at a dog's bark. The dog was forgiven, fear was not. Elena wrote this inside herself. The world preferred quiet girls who bled in private. One winter afternoon she brought home a drawing. A house under a sky of impossible blue, her parents in a doorway that let out light. The door doesn't open that way, her mother said. Elena studied the picture until the blue looked foolish. She did not draw doors for a long time. There were good days, brief and ordinary. Oranges on the step. Her father lifting her to see dust like stars. Her mother humming. Good taught hope, hope taught risk, risk returned her to tone. By 11 she knew from the keys in the lock what kind of evening was entering. She measured rooms by exits, conversations by thresholds, people by seams. She kept arithmetic of her own, small cuts, careful stitches. If she cried, she used a towel because towels did not report. At 13 a secret she trusted to one friend slipped into the mouth of another. The laugh traveled farther than the secret. You're overreacting, they said when she withdrew from both. It was nothing. Nothing was the size of a hallway where you no longer knew where to stand. She rebranded herself as the girl who did not care. She practiced a camouflage shrug, trained her voice to sound like she'd never been surprised. It worked until it didn't. Not caring was only caring with the door locked. Years folded like towels. Elena became Lena, and then, when she needed a beginning, Elle. She moved to a city where her name was pronounced correctly and no one knew the blueprint of her size. If asked about family, she said they lived out of town, as if feelings were a suburb you could visit on Sundays. Work felt like relief. Rubrics, checklists, outcomes you could point to. She was promoted for precision, praised for anticipating disaster before it knocked. The old arithmetic adapted. She counted risks instead of offenses. But people are not rubrics. A joke in a meeting landed wrong. Don't take it personally, someone said, a glove hiding a fist. She smiled because housing panic is a life skill. Later, alone at her desk, she wrote emails that sounded like bridges already burning. Then Daniel arrived, new to the team, easy in his body, compliments with the tone of help. He admired her notes and steadiness under pressure. He called her sensitive in all the right ways. The words fell warm then cooled. She heard the hinge where praise could swing into instruction. She wanted to believe this time would be different. She wanted doors that opened outward and rooms where tone was not a trap. Here was the math of longing. Add trust to history and expect subtraction. On a snowfall evening, as office lights died in sequence, Daniel stopped at her desk. He told a story about resilience. He used the word frail, retracted it with a smile. The building breathed its night breath. Inside her, the house rose, Lemon soap, winter coats, radiators bracing. The past is not past. It is a hallway you carry. Elle straightened papers straightened and felt the cabinet slam again, heard the neighbor laugh, felt the word-sensitive bend her name. I should go, she said. She put on her coat and stepped into the corridor. The button lit for the lobby, but the floor that opened belonged to years before, the one where she learned tone outranked truth, and that survival could sound polite. The door slid. She carried the hallway with her into the lights. She walked out of the building with the hallway still folded inside her, like a map she never meant to carry. Night held the city in its cold palm. Streetlights made small islands of safety on wet pavement. She chose the bright parts and crossed between them, shoulder tipped away from strangers who brushed too close. The wind smelled of pretzels and bus brakes. A woman argued softly into her phone. A child laughed at a puddle that knew how to make stars. Home, for Elle, was an apartment high enough to forget the street and low enough to hear it anyway. Keys, lock, hinge, the choreography of entry. She hung her coat on the peg that didn't wobble and set her bag in the square of light that always found the rug first. The radiator ticked in a language of cautious approval. She exhaled, but not all the way. Breathing, like trusting, was something to do in increments. She had made the place disciplined. Books by color. Cups nested by size. A plant that obeyed the window and a desk that faced the door so surprises had to announce themselves. In the kitchen she poured water and drank it like instruction. The glass left around on the counter, one small permission to be imperfect. She wiped it anyway. At the mirror by the hall she met her face the way you meet a colleague at the elevator. Polite, practiced, ready for the day's script. She checked for errors, mascara smudge, hair gone astray, any visible evidence of unruliness, then stopped, palms flat on the dresser, surprised by the tenderness that rose without consent. She whispered, "You made it," to the girl who had memorized exits and learned to smile without showing her teeth. The girl didn't answer. She never did. But she stayed. Morning came in squares on the floor. Coffee, toast, the email preview that asked for things already given. The city unlatched itself in 1,000 directions. Elle put on her coat, her bag, and the mask that fit like a custom-made silence. It wasn't a lie, the mask. It was a filter that made other people easier. Work lived on the 12th floor behind glass that thought very highly of itself. The open office had no doors but many borders. People performed competence at adjustable desks, casting their shadows onto slides. Elle's desk was a harbor, clean lines, a pen that worked, a succulent with ambitions. She logged in. The system greeted her with a warm indifference that could pass for love if you never asked for more. Meetings were theaters with softer chairs. She took her seat, measured air, and did the math. Who needed reassurance, who would interrupt, who had a joke already chambered. When the slide showed a number pretending to be truth, she lifted her hand and asked the kind of question that looks like curiosity and sounds like a boundary. Heads tilted. Someone wrote her name on a list titled Reliable. The list felt safe and also like a leash. Daniel arrived late, which was part of how he entered rooms. After everyone, before anyone could resent it. He took the chair beside her and smiled like a door you weren't sure you wanted to open. "Big day," he whispered. The whisper rubbed her ear and left a thread. The presentation trod through its paces. When it faltered, Elle held it up without making a show of lifting. Afterward, people exhaled as if they had achieved something difficult when really she had prevented something worse. In the hallway, Daniel touched her elbow to steer her toward the coffee. His fingers were light, her body stepped away anyway. "You saved us," he said. Again. "I kept the numbers from lying," she said. He laughed. Sensitive in all the right ways. It landed like a feather dipped in mercury. She smiled the careful smile that closes a file. "I have edits," she said and peeled off toward her desk. The mask worked until small hours, then asked for payment. At 2, when most screens slept, Al's desk lamp made a small planet of light where emails orbited. A message from a client flared, praise wrapped around a request that cut. "We value your attention to detail. If you could soften your tone in the next draft." Soften your tone. The phrase moved the furniture of her chest. She inhaled, counted to 5, exhaled into a sentence so calm it barely touched the ground. This too was survival. Write like rain on glass, let the sharpness travel as a riverbed beneath. In the quiet she remembered the lemon hallway and thought how much of her life was engineered to keep doors from slamming. She adjusted constantly. It was a craft now, almost a talent, the way you refold a map until it fits the pocket you have. On Thursdays she called her mother. It was a contract signed years ago. Weekly, brief, civil. "Work is good," Elle would say. "I'm fine." Her mother would remind her about weather she was not experiencing and cousins she barely knew. If Elle mentioned tiredness, her mother said, "Mind your tone." Even the phone learned to hold its breath. There were other lives that touched hers lightly. The barista who remembered she liked an extra splash, the neighbor who watered her plant when she traveled and never asked why she traveled so often. Once, on a Sunday that felt loose around the edges, she went to a gallery alone and stood in front of a painting that was mostly blue. The blue was not impossible, it had been earned. She felt something open and close in her ribs. A child tugged her sleeve and asked, "Are you sad?" She said, "No," then wished the word had a better shape. Weeks braided themselves into a rope you could climb or hang from. Deadlines tightened. Promotions dangled like ornaments that proved nothing and calmed no one. Elle was named lead on a project that required her to make plans other people would ignore. She wrote them anyway, lines straight as rails, because rails are still railroads even when trains pretend to be birds. In a review, her manager slid kindness across the table like a plate with too much salt. "Your instincts are exceptional. If anything, you could be less intense with the team. Some feel you take things personally." The sentence wore the same cologne as the hallway. She nodded because dignity is sometimes a nod. Later, in the restroom, she locked a stall and stood, hands braced on a metal door that had heard every version of every woman's quiet. She breathed until numbers replaced words. 5 in, 5 out. Survive. The mask did not crack that day. It polished itself and went on. At a colleague's birthday, a bar pretended to be a living room if living rooms were loud and dim and full of people who wanted the same night. Elle held a glass and found the part of the room where you could watch without seeming to watch. Daniel found her there as if he had a map too. "You never dance," he said. "I don't need to be seen to be here," she said. "That's almost poetic," he said, turning it into permission to continue. "You know, sometimes I think you're misunderstood. You feel more than most. It can read as sharp. But that's only because you care." The word sharp set a plate spinning on a stick. She steadied it with a sentence that smiled. Everyone has edges. Later, under the door of her apartment, the hallway returned like weather. She set down the shoes that had carried her perfectly through rooms that kept testifying against themselves. The city hummed its lullaby of sirens and distant laughter. She made tea and did not drink it. She sat on the floor, back against the bed, and let silence rise to meet her. What would it be like, she wondered, to live without rephrasing yourself for other people's comfort? To feel everything you felt and not be asked to carry the weight of their ease? She imagined walking into a room and letting the door stay a door. No hinges hidden in compliments. No softening the truth until it stopped being true. The kettle cooled. The mask, set gently on the nightstand, watched her sleep the way a helmet watches the head it protects. In the morning, when the glass on the counter made a new round and she left it there, she was almost surprised by her own permission. It stayed through breakfast, through the elevator, through the lobby's carbon copy conversation. It stayed until she reached the 12th floor and the light found her desk and the day asked its usual price. Daniel was already standing by her chair, coffee in hand, smile precise. "Big presentation at the gala next week," he said. "You'll be brilliant." The word brilliant floated. The hinge gleamed. She felt the hallway shift inside her. The coats, the lemon, the cabinet that knew how to slam by itself. She put her bag down carefully, as if carefulness could save anyone, and met his eyes long enough to set a boundary he might not see. "Let's keep the language honest," she said. "On stage and off." He laughed, friendly as weather. "See," he said. "Sensitive in the right ways." The mask slipped into place with a softness that could be mistaken for peace. But something beneath it had begun to move, a current adjusting the shape of the shore. She opened the project file and the day began. Outside, the city rehearsed its 1,000 entrances. Inside, a door she had always kept closed pressed against its frame, patient, learning the weight of light. The day did not announce itself as different. It carried the same smell of burnt coffee from the break room, the same shuffle of shoes on polished floors, the same shuffle of emails multiplying like weeds. But the smallest details often disguised the biggest breaks. Elle arrived early as always and stacked her work neatly, edges aligned, her world in order. By noon, that order would be in shreds. It began in a meeting that should have been routine. The team gathered around the long glass table, laptops open like shields. Charts glowed on the wall. Elle presented her findings in her measured way, each slide precise, each number armored with proof. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. Facts were her protection, her language of choice. Then Marissa spoke. Marissa, with her easy smile and careless tone. "Elle, don't you think you're overcomplicating things? You always make it sound more dramatic than it really is. We just need to simplify. The room chuckled politely, a ripple that brushed against Elle like sandpaper. Her throat tightened. Overcomplicating. Dramatic. The words were echoes from another hallway, disguised in professional polish. She inhaled slowly, fingers tapping the table once, twice before she answered. Numbers don't become less true because you're uncomfortable with them, she said. The laughter died quickly, replaced by silence that had sharp edges. Marissa flushed but smirked anyway, leaning back in her chair. See? Sensitive again. I was only joking. That word, sensitive, struck like a match. The flame leapt up before Elle could smother it. She turned, eyes fixed on Marissa, voice calm but trembling at its edges. You weren't joking. You wanted the room to laugh at me so they wouldn't have to listen. That's not simplification. That's erasure. Gasps, the kind that people don't mean to release, fluttered across the room. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between them, a silent referee no one had asked for. The manager cleared his throat. Let's stay on track, he murmured, but the track had already split. Elle gathered her papers with a deliberateness that felt like breaking glass. She didn't storm out. Storms are loud, and her silence was louder. She simply closed her laptop, stood, and walked from the room. The echo of her footsteps followed her down the hallway like applause no one dared to give. In the restroom, she locked herself into the farthest stall. Her breath came shallow, as though the walls were pressing in. She pressed her palms against her thighs until they stung, grounding herself. She hated the tears that prickled but refused to fall. She would not give them that. Not again. When she returned to her desk, whispers curved like smoke around her. Screens glowed, but no one looked directly at her. Marissa avoided her eyes. Daniel hovered, hesitant. At last he approached, resting a paper cup of coffee on the corner of her desk. You're right, you know, he said softly. But people don't like being told so directly. Elle looked up at him, and for the first time in weeks she didn't hide the rawness in her gaze. Maybe people should learn to listen instead of laughing, she replied. Daniel nodded, but his smile held a trace of warning, as if to say the world would not bend just because she wanted it straighter. He walked away, and she sipped the coffee only to realize it was bitterer than usual. That evening, when she reached her apartment, the mask slipped off with the heaviness of something worn too long. She set her bag down, shoes kicked aside, and collapsed onto the couch. Her plant by the window seemed to lean toward her, as if reaching. She whispered to the empty room, "Why does the truth always cost so much?" The city outside pulsed with its usual indifference. Sirens, laughter, a bus sighing at the curb. Inside, Elle sat with the weight of the first rupture. Something had cracked, and though no one else could see it, she knew. Cracks don't vanish. They spread. The night deepened, and in the dark she replayed the meeting again and again. Marissa's smirk. The laughter. The word that followed her like a curse. Sensitive. She promised herself she wouldn't let it pass next time. Next time she would hold her ground harder, louder if she had to. But promises made in the dark often turn into fuel for the next fire. And Elle's fire had only just begun to burn. The crack from that meeting did not seal. It spread. Tiny at first, invisible to most, but Elle felt it with every step she took into the office. Conversation slowed when she passed. Laughter rose just after she turned the corner. Marissa kept her distance, her smirk now sharpened into silence, and silence can wound more than words. Daniel tried in his way to soften the edges. He stopped by her desk with casual comments, little attempts at warmth. Rough week, huh? Or, ignore Marissa, she gets jealous. But his reassurances felt like bandages pressed on wounds still bleeding. They could not stop the deeper ache, the sense that her place among them had shifted. At home the shift grew heavier. Calls with her mother became sharper. Why do you always make trouble for yourself? Her mother asked after Elle mentioned the tension at work. If people laugh, just laugh with them. It's easier that way. Elle gripped the phone tighter, the words slicing like they had in childhood. Easier that way. Quieter that way. Smaller that way. Friends began to retreat too. Invitations that once arrived without thought came less often. At a dinner with two old college friends, Elle tried to explain what had happened in the office, her voice steady but lined with frustration. One friend sighed, swirling wine in her glass. Elle, maybe you just need to stop taking things so personally. Not everything is about you. The sentence landed like a blade hidden in velvet. Elle smiled tightly, nodding as though she agreed, but inside she folded further inward. She left early that night, inventing an excuse, walking streets that blurred beneath her shoes. Her marriage, or what remained of it, didn't survive the spreading cracks either. Thomas had been patient once, or maybe indifferent. He listened in half nods when she recounted the struggles at work. But patience thins when tested too often. One night, after another story of being called too sensitive, he set down his fork with a clatter. "Elle, do you hear yourself? You make battles out of whispers. Do you want to be at war with everyone?" The silence between them after that was wide enough to drown in. They stopped eating at the same table. He lingered at work later. She curled on the couch with her laptop, seeking refuge in tasks that asked nothing of her heart. Even the neighbors noticed. The woman upstairs, who once left cookies at her door, now only offered polite nods in the hallway. The plant by the window began to wither, its leaves curling inward like clenched fists. Elle watered it faithfully, but it seemed to mimic her spirit, folding tighter with each passing day. At the office, the rupture grew into reputation. She overheard her name once, hushed behind glass. "She's intense," someone whispered. "Hard to work with." Another voice, "Brilliant but sensitive. You have to tiptoe around her." The words branded her in absentia. She carried them like weights in her chest. One Friday, Daniel invited her for coffee after work. They sat near the window of a small cafe, rain streaking down glass. He leaned forward, his voice gentle. "You know I respect you. You're the sharpest person here. But," he hesitated, stirring his cup, "sometimes you don't give people room. They feel like you're punishing them." Elle stared into her own untouched drink. "So I should make myself smaller? Again? That's not what I said." He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I just don't want you to burn bridges you'll need later." She walked home that night under an umbrella that trembled in the wind. Bridges, she thought. What use are bridges if they only carry people walking over you? The loneliness settled heavier in her apartment. The rooms felt louder in their quiet. She lay awake at night, the glow of the city bleeding through the blinds, remembering laughter that cut, conversations that silenced, friendships that evaporated. Each memory pressed against her ribs, a collection of small betrayals, sharp and cumulative. By morning she moved through her routines with robotic precision. Coffee, toast, emails. The mask still worked in public, but inside it, the cracks deepened. And once cracks spread far enough, they no longer stay hidden. The bonds of her life, family, friends, marriage, colleagues, were no longer threads holding her together. They were frayed ropes, snapping one by one, leaving her suspended in a silence that threatened to consume her. Elle told herself she was stronger for it. That solitude meant freedom. That needing no one was a kind of power. But power without connection tastes like ash. And she was beginning to taste it every day. It was meant to be a celebration. The company's annual gala, the kind of event dressed in velvet and polished speeches, where people wore borrowed confidence with their tailored suits. Chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks. Music from a live quartet drifted, fragile as glass. On tables, name cards marked alliances more than seats. Elle had been asked to speak. She had accepted, though every instinct told her the night would demand more than it offered. She arrived in a black dress that felt like armor. Around her, colleagues laughed with the sheen of champagne, their words bright but hollow. Daniel greeted her warmly, hand brushing her shoulder as if to anchor her. "Big moment tonight," he said. His smile suggested reassurance, but his eyes carried a flicker of warning. She took her place near the stage, sipping water, preparing lines she had practiced until they lost their weight. The speech was simple, professional, meant to show competence without stirring conflict. But the room was restless, and restlessness has a way of finding its target. It began with Marissa. Of course it did. She passed by Elle's table, her glass raised, voice pitched to Carrie. "Careful, everyone. Elle might take offense if we clap too loudly. Sensitive ears, you know." Laughter bubbled around the table, polite, nervous but sharp enough to cut. Elle froze. The word sliced through her again, that cursed word, dragging the past into the present like an unwanted guest. Sensitive. It echoed against every hallway she had carried since childhood. She stood before she realized it. The chair scraped back, startling those near her. Eyes turned. Conversations hushed. The quartet stumbled to a stop. Even the chandeliers seemed to burn colder. "Sensitive," she repeated, her voice calm yet thrumming. "That's the word you chose." Marissa laughed again, softer now, defensive. "It was just a joke." "No," Elle said, stepping forward. Her heels clicked against the floor, each sound a punctuation. It was not a joke. It was a dismissal. A way to turn truth into performance, pain into entertainment. The crowd shifted, whispers curling between tables. Some looked at Marissa, others at Elle, weighing the sides of an argument that had not asked for their judgment but demanded it anyway. You call me sensitive, Elle continued, her eyes sweeping the room. But what you really mean is inconvenient. You mean that my memory is longer than your comfort. That my honesty feels like accusation. That my refusal to laugh when you bruise me makes you the victim. Gasps, nervous laughter, the scrape of cutlery set down too quickly. Daniel half rose from his chair, hand extended as though he could tether her. She didn't stop. This company thrives on people swallowing their words, she said, voice rising. On women who smile while being dismissed, on men who call control guidance, on everyone who learns that silence is safer than truth. But tonight I will not be silent. Tonight you will hear what it feels like to live branded by a word you never chose. Marissa's smile collapsed. The manager shifted uncomfortably, whispering to someone at his side. A man near the back muttered, "This isn't the time." But Elle had reached the point where time was irrelevant. Her voice trembled, not with fear but with the sheer force of holding years inside. You think I bruise easily. But bruises don't appear without impact. And every so-called joke, every label, every whisper meant to cut me down has left marks you don't see. I'm not sensitive. I'm scarred. And scars, she said, stepping onto the edge of the stage now, the microphone in her hand, are proof that wounds did not win. The room erupted, not with applause but with noise. Gasps, murmurs, phones raised. Some faces lit with admiration, others with disapproval. Marissa folded into herself, cheeks burning. Daniel's face was pale, uncertain whether to intervene or to let her burn. Elle stood beneath the chandelier, no longer poised, no longer contained. She was raw, unmasked, unrepentant. For the first time she did not care if the room loved her or loathed her. What mattered was that they had listened, and could never unhear. When she lowered the microphone, the silence that followed was immense. The gala had ended, though no one had announced it. Conversation stumbled back like people finding their footing after an earthquake. She left the stage with her head high, but inside, something fragile trembled. She had spoken truth, yes, but truth always demanded payment. And the cost would come soon. As the doors closed behind her and the night air rushed cold against her skin, she knew she had crossed the line. There was no going back to the version of herself who swallowed, nodded, endured. Whatever waited beyond this moment would be built from rupture, not repair. And Elle, whether she admitted it or not, was ready. The Monday after the gala began with silence. Not the usual silence of a city stretching into its week, but a silence sharpened, deliberate. In the office lobby, colleagues offered quick nods without words. Conversations cut themselves short when Elle entered the elevator. The 12th floor hummed as always, but the hum bent around her like water avoiding stone. Her inbox told the story more clearly. Subject lines that once carried collaboration now carried distance. Follow up without you. Reassigned. Status change. She scrolled through them with a hand that trembled only when no one was watching. By midday, her manager called her into a glass-walled office. He gestured for her to sit, his tone measured, his eyes careful. Elle, about the gala? He paused, searching for words that wouldn't set anything aflame. What you said, it was powerful. But some people felt it was inappropriate for the setting. We have to consider team cohesion. Cohesion. The word tasted of rope pulled tighter around her throat. She listened, nodded once, and left the office without defending herself. Defense, she realized, was exactly what they expected. Silence unsettled them more. At her desk, Daniel approached cautiously, a file in his hand as cover. He leaned down, voice low. You were brave, he said. But brave makes enemies. Be careful. His concern rang genuine, yet it dripped with helplessness. He could not protect her from what bravery cost. The days that followed grew lonelier. Meetings were scheduled without her. Lunch tables filled before she arrived. Even the barista downstairs, once cheerful with extra foam, handed her coffee with eyes that avoided hers, as if scandal could stain through skin. At home, the fracture deepened. Thomas no longer pretended patience. Do you see what you've done? He asked, voice flat across the dinner table they rarely shared. You've made yourself the center of every storm. It's exhausting. I told the truth, Elle answered. At what price? His fork clattered against the plate. Is the truth worth losing everything? She did not reply. The silence stretched, thicker than argument. That night he slept on the couch without saying why. 2 weeks later he packed a bag without saying goodbye. Her mother's voice through the phone was no softer. You could have let it go, she said. Women must learn when to stay quiet. Do you want to end up alone? Elle stared at the wall as her mother spoke, the lemon hallway of memory unrolling again. She had been told the same thing as a child. Quiet was safety, smallness was survival. But survival and living were not the same thing. Friends faded next. Invitations stopped entirely. Social media turned her into a spectacle. Clips from the gala circulated, stripped of context, captioned with commentary that cut deeper than any meeting room chuckle. Overreacting executive. Corporate meltdown. The sensitive one. Each view, each share, added weight to her name until it bent beneath the labels. Even walking the city felt different. Once she had blended into its rhythm. Now she felt eyes on her, imagined whispers trailing behind. A stranger brushed her shoulder on the subway and muttered, "Watch it, lady," and her pulse flared as though the word sensitive had been spoken again. She clenched the pole, willing herself not to unravel in public. Nights became her only refuge. She brewed tea she rarely drank, sat by the withering plant and watched shadows crawl the walls. The silence pressed harder now, filling every corner of the apartment with echoes of absence. The missing husband, the absent friends, the laughter that had turned against her. Yet beneath the weight, something unexpected stirred. Freedom, sharp and terrifying. She no longer had to smile at jokes that wounded, no longer had to pretend that silence was peace. The bridges were already burned. She did not need to guard them anymore. One evening Daniel called. His voice was quiet, heavy. "I'm worried about you," he said. "I'm fine," she lied. "You've lost so much," he pressed. "Work friends, Thomas. Don't let pride take the rest." She almost told him the truth, that pride was the only thing she hadn't lost, the only anchor she still clung to. Instead she said, "Thank you," and ended the call. Afterward, she stood at the window watching the city pulse below. The plant by the glass leaned toward her as if listening. She touched one brittle leaf and whispered, "They think I've broken. But they don't know. Scars are not breaks. Scars are survival." The city lights flickered like witnesses. She had paid dearly for her defiance. Friends, marriage, reputation. The cost was higher than she had ever imagined. Yet for the first time in her life the price belonged to her alone. The silence no longer smothered. It waited. It prepared. Because a story like hers does not end with loss. It waits for the moment when loss sharpens into something else. Something stronger, something irreversible. And that moment was closer than anyone, even Elle, dared to admit. The city moved on as cities do. News cycles shifted, offices buzzed with new dramas, and faces turned toward fresher scandals. But Elle's world remained suspended in the aftermath, heavy with silence that had not healed but hardened. The gala had left her marked, her job diminished, her marriage abandoned, her friendships dissolved. Yet beneath all that rubble, something inside her had begun to change. The weight that once bent her was transforming into something else, something sharper. It began one gray morning, when she entered the office to find her desk emptied. Not cleared, but relocated, moved to the far end of the floor, near the copier where machines sighed and overheated. No announcement, no explanation. A quiet exile disguised as logistics. People walked by without meeting her eyes. Daniel appeared in her doorway later, sympathy painted across his face. "It's not personal," he said. Elle let out a small laugh, brittle as glass. "Everything they say about me is personal. Isn't that the point?" He didn't argue. He only looked at her with that mixture of care and caution that had grown too familiar. Then he left her there, in the hum of the copier, the smell of toner curling around her like a warning. That night, she returned to an apartment that seemed emptier than usual. Thomas's absence was now a permanent space. His bookshelves cleared, his keys no longer on the hook. The plant had finally given up, leaves brittle, soil dry. She dropped her bag and sank to the floor. For a long time, she did nothing but listen to the hollow inside her chest. Then came the email. A formal notice from management, citing her disruptive conduct at the gala and continued challenges with team dynamics. Words meant to sound professional but carrying the coldness of exile. She read it twice, then a third time, each pass etching the truth deeper. They were preparing to let her go. For hours, she sat at her desk, staring at the screen, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Rage rose, hot and uncontainable. For years she had bitten her tongue, softened her tone, folded herself smaller to make others comfortable. And now, even after all that, they would discard her like a broken file. Her hands trembled as she opened a new message, her words pouring out unchecked. She wrote of the hypocrisy, the men praised for aggression, the women punished for passion, the endless gaslighting dressed as humor. She wrote of Marissa, of her manager, of every sensitive branded onto her skin. her sentences sharpened into daggers. When she was done, she hovered over the send button, her pulse a drum in her ears. It would be the end. She knew it. But some ends are cleaner than silence. With one breath she pressed send. The fallout was immediate. Phones buzzed across the office. Screens lit up with her words. Whispers spread faster than wildfire, and soon managers huddled in glass rooms, their faces pale behind tinted glass. By noon her badge no longer opened doors. Security, polite but firm, escorted her from the building. The walk through the lobby was a corridor of stairs. Some eyes were wide with shock, others narrowed with judgment, a few glimmered with admiration quickly hidden. Daniel was there, standing by the elevators, his expression torn between pride and fear. He whispered as she passed, "You've gone too far." Elle lifted her chin, her voice steady. "No. I've finally gone far enough." Outside the air was sharp with winter. She stood on the sidewalk, her bag heavy in her hand, her career behind her like a building she had set aflame. The city roared around her, taxis, footsteps, sirens, but within her chest there was only stillness. That night, she sat in her apartment surrounded by shadows, the silence pressing in again. But this silence was different. It was not exile. It was not loneliness. It was aftermath, the kind that follows a storm, when the world is broken open and waiting to be remade. She looked at the wilted plant, its leaves curled like fists, and for the first time she didn't feel pity. She felt recognition. Survival was not always about staying alive in the same shape. Sometimes survival meant burning, collapsing, and beginning again from ash. Elle had crossed the final limit. She had severed the last tether. The cost was staggering, her job, her marriage, her friends, her reputation. But for the first time she belonged wholly to herself. The city lights flickered through the window, and in their glow she whispered, "Scars are not weakness. They are the places where I refuse to break." And in that moment she realized she was no longer afraid of silence. She was its author. The days after the storm unfolded strangely quiet. No emails to check, no schedules to chase, no voices calling her name in tones laced with warning or dismissal. For the first time in years, Elle woke without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing on her chest. The apartment was still bare, the plants still lifeless, the spaces once shared still empty, but the silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like possibility. She walked the city with unhurried steps, blending with strangers yet separate in a way she chose. The subway rumbled, markets called out prices, children laughed on sidewalks. Life went on, uncaring of who had fallen, who had spoken, who had burned bridges behind them. And for once, Elle felt no urge to explain herself to anyone. She carried her scars openly, like maps of where she had been. At night, she sat by the window, watching the pulse of lights across the skyline. Every glow seemed like a question. Was it worth it? Did you gain anything by losing everything? She touched the cold glass and whispered into the dark, "I gained myself." Because the truth was simple. A life lived in constant fear of offense is not a life lived at all. To shrink, to swallow, to soften every truth for others' comfort. That was the prison she had inherited, the one she had carried since childhood. Breaking free had cost her dearly, but some freedoms cannot be bought cheap. Her story was no longer about Daniel or Marissa, or the colleagues who whispered her name like a warning. It was no longer about Thomas or her mother, or the voices that had told her to be quieter, smaller, safer. It was about her, and the moment she decided that silence was no longer survival, it was surrender. She leaned back in her chair, the city breathing below her, and let the thought settle. People will always label what they cannot control. They will call strength arrogance, memory sensitivity, defiance madness. But labels do not define the soul. Actions do. Choices do. Scars do. And as her eyes drifted shut, one question lingered, echoing not only for her but for anyone listening, anyone who had ever swallowed words just to be accepted. How many times have you stayed silent just to be loved? If this story made you reflect on silence, scars, and the price of truth, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might be the mirror someone else needs.